we've arranged today. And just to say that although I'm from human genetics, this is a combined seminar from human genetics, which we're hosting, but it's the IDM seminar. And as you know, the ICGB is also part of this seminar series. And unfortunately, just because of the timing, the director of the IDM and the ICGB, as far as I can see, are not here today. So we're representing human genetics, Raj and myself, but we welcome you all very warmly. And this is a very diverse audience because of the nature of the talk and the speaker. And so I said to Noah when he contacted me and we decided to organize the seminar, that I can't predict what the audience is going to be made up of. Predominantly there are human genetics staff and students here because we encourage our department to come, but I can see from various walks of life here, not just academia, outside of academia because we advertised it accordingly, and then also from upper campus from the humanities and from anthropology and from philosophy. So it's quite a task that we've given you to address everybody here today. And so I'd like to welcome you warmly to UCT, to the IDM, which as I said to you, and Velma Jacquie welcomes you and said she apologizes that she's not here. I spoke to Noah last night and I said, you know, what I'd like to do is introduce you, but not according to what the blurb that we sent you on the flyer, because you've all read that. I hope that's what's brought you here. So I said, why don't you tell me a bit about yourself, the person, so the man behind the talk, and what it is that, and why you actually came to Africa from the United States, and also how you came to me, because I've only met Noah for 5 minutes. He asked if he could interview me. I met with him and Renata Hilleman, who's unfortunately not here today either. And so I'm going to read you just briefly 3 little pieces out of a whole page that he's given me on himself. And I picked out some specific areas that I'm going to highlight. I'm then going to hand over to you to give us the talk. And then I have asked our head of department, Raj Ramesar, to take the question and answers afterwards, because I want to take this out of the usual human genetics seminar and DNA and what DNA actually does into the bigger global picture of exactly how you're looking at DNA. So, and that's what Raj has been tasked with, to please lead us into that discussion. After that, the IDM has arranged special snacks upstairs for us to meet the speakers. So I'm going to ask you not to all come down here to speak to Noah afterwards, because as he said, he's very happy to take questions, but what we want to do is actually rather socialize upstairs. So we'll let the bride and groom walk out here ahead of us, and then we'll go out. We'll organize to get your stuff to follow you. And then, so if you two will go out first, we will follow, and then we will ask you questions upstairs. Is that okay? Okay, so just very briefly then, what Noah said to me is that I grew up in the United States in a small town in Massachusetts. I went to college in Colorado at a small liberal arts school called Colorado College. I was drawn to anthropology, speaking to the anthropologist here, for my very first semester, although my initial interest in biological anthropology quickly gave way to cultural anthropology, and I was asked who was represented here, and I don't know if it's cultural or biological. My interest in Africa was sparked by a philosophy course called Philosophy of Africa, and I think you're probably going to address that and how you then got into what your thesis is, which I believe is a lot of what we're going to be hearing today. He then goes on to say that since completing my PhD in 2011, I taught cultural anthropology at Brandeis University and the University of Pennsylvania, where I was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Penn Humanities Forum, and I'm now assistant professor at Comparative Studies at Ohio State University in Columbus. That part we also knew out of what he gave us. I live there with my wife, who is also a cultural anthropologist and is an assistant professor in women, gender, and sexuality studies. I'm now completing my book manuscript and beginning new research on criminal DNA forensics in South Africa, and it was through this work that we got to meet one another, and as I say, Renata Hilleman was the key to introducing us. So thank you very much for coming to speak to us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for that warm introduction, and thank you all for being here. So as she said, you're a diverse crowd, and I'll do my best to engage all of you without alienating any of you. We'll see how well that works. I think it's a rare and wonderful opportunity, actually, to have scientists and humanists in the room together. I think it's something increasingly that we need to be doing with the challenges that face us in the world today. So I'm really thrilled that we're all here. Now, if any of you are cultural anthropologists or science and technology studies scholars, you'll have to bear with me. I have a brief section of the talk where I kind of give a very short, possibly idiosyncratic take on what those fields are, with the expectation that a large number of people in the room are scientists and not necessarily familiar with those fields. So, you see the title here. Now, let's see how this works. Okay. So my talk today emerges from 2 genetic ancestry studies that were conducted by different teams of researchers who each separately investigated Lemba origins and links to Jews. The first study was conducted by Trevor Jenkins, who many of you are probably familiar with, and one of his graduate students. They collected blood samples for their study beginning in 1987. And the study's purpose was to investigate whether DNA might be a useful tool to validate origins. In 1996, they published their results in the American Journal of Human Genetics. Now, they found that Lemba Y chromosomes showed evidence of a possible Semitic origin. And these findings led them to conclude that Lemba DNA supported Lemba oral history. The second set of researchers was a collaborative group that brought together Jewish studies and biblical studies scholars with a team of geneticists in London who had already been working on Jewish genetics for several years. Now, they collected saliva samples in 1996, and they published their results in 2000, also in the American Journal of Human Genetics. This study built on earlier research by some of the same authors who had identified a genetic sequence, and they named that genetic sequence the Cohen modal haplotype. Some of you may have heard of that. The shortened version there is a CMH. And the CMH appeared more frequently in self-identified Kohanim, or Jewish priests, than it did in other Jews or in non-Jewish populations. Now, in the Lemba study, this group of researchers used the CMH as a genetic tool. They suggested that if it was present in a population, that could indicate Jewish descent. So they found the CMH in similar proportions to those of their previous study, and this even included a higher frequency in one Lemba clan that matched the frequency of the self-identified Kohanim. Okay, so again, they also concluded that their results were consistent with Lemba oral history and consistent with the utility of the CMH as a kind of analytic tool to determine ancestry. So the point of my talk today, though, is not actually the studies themselves, whether their scientific merits or how we might debate their findings on scientific grounds using the concepts, terms, and criteria of geneticists. There's no doubt much to say about these studies from these scientific perspectives, and not least because genetic ancestry research has changed so much since they were completed. But my questions, though, emerge from a different place. They emerge from cultural anthropology and the social study of science and technology. And these are both fields, again, that bridge the humanities and social sciences. So, apologies to the cultural anthropologists in the room if there are any. Cultural anthropology can be defined as a study of culture, which itself is notoriously difficult to define and is in fact often actually contentious within the discipline. It's one of the central things that we debate. But cultural anthropology is also defined methodologically. It's the field of study that really pioneered ethnographic research methods. Now, ethnographic research methods entail in-depth and long-term immersion with particular people and places in order to generate new theoretical and empirical knowledge that can illuminate some aspect of life more broadly, whether that's political, religious, social, or increasingly scientific. For cultural anthropologists working today, all of this constitutes a study of culture. And culture, in turn, refers to the material forms, the interpretive meanings, and the assignment of value that enable us to exist in relation to one another and to our environment. So one way to understand the field of science and technology studies, which is usually referred to as STS, is that it approaches science as a space of culture. This approach can be at times disorienting for those who view science as the realm of objective science, defined against the vision of humanities as the realm of subjective interpretation. But STS aims to complicate these binary distinctions in order to support really two things: better, more self-aware science on the one hand, and to encourage scientific literacies among humanists and the general public on the other hand. So STS takes as its foundational premise that science and society are not separate realms of thought or experience. Rather, they're actually continually constituting one another in a feedback loop, right? So the idea here is that on the one hand, the questions that scientists ask and the methods they use to answer their questions are shaped by cultural values and societal concerns. And on the other hand, scientific study and the production of new technologies actually change culture and society. So, for example, in my research area of genetic ancestry, the foundational premise here for STS is that genetic studies and geneticists should be analyzed to better understand the cultural values and societal concerns that have led to the kinds of questions asked of DNA. And the social and cultural impact of the existence of genetic ancestry data should in turn be traced and analyzed, right? So in this feedback loop. Increasingly, it's ethnography that's actually called upon to map these interrelationships and to interpret their meaning. Together, these fields take social relations, cultural production, and questions of meaning, value, and exchange as their central concerns. They prompt us to ask a series of questions about DNA that I'll be addressing in a moment. So here are the questions. What does ethnography tell us about DNA that genetic studies cannot? How are genetic studies lived outside of scientific research? And how does DNA become meaningful in society? And now I should say that DNA is actually, it's emerging as an important area of study in cultural anthropology and STS, in part because genetics holds now an ever more important place in how we think about the social significance of biology and the biology of human relatedness and race. And this is really a transnational phenomenon. Genetic research has really become a pervasive and an authoritative means to apprehend the past, both in terms of ideas of universal human history, so how we're all related to one another, but also in terms of differentiated racial and ethnic ancestry, right? So how we might understand human differences and how they relate historically to one another. And some examples of this are, the Completed Human Genome Project is one example. In the US, there are a number of popular television shows, one of which is called African American Lives, which uses genetic data to kind of help people find ancestry beyond what the documentary record can show them. And direct-to-consumer personal genetic ancestry tests, which basically do the same thing, but individual consumers purchase them for themselves. And then National Geographic has a massive genographic project that is trying to map all human relatedness through a combination of opt-in by consumer and recruitment of different populations that they deem genetically significant. So within STS literatures, where scientific engagements with race have long been an important area of inquiry, genomics at this point emerged as the critical site through which to analyze how race matters in and through contemporary technoscience. And there's a number of scholars who are working on this. Some of them, I don't know, in this room you may not have heard of, Jenny Reardon, Kim Tallbear, Nadia Abu-Alhaj, and Jonathan Marks, for example. All of these people study genomic scientists to examine how they understand and use race in their research. and how their research in turn can sometimes actually reinforce long-standing ideas about racial difference. The STS literature on race and genomics, especially in the US context, aims to contribute to the unraveling of race as a biological concept of difference, while also accounting for the social and political salience of race, racism, and processes of racialization. So one example of this, a scholar named Duane Wiley argues that by analyzing the labels that geneticists use for their samples, we can actually account for how socially meaningful concepts of race enter into scientific discourse. And then, in turn, they appear to support ideas of genetically meaningful racial difference. And this is the case even when the geneticists working with them don't actually hold these views, right? So that's what she's tracing. Other people like Michael Montoya have focused on medical genetics. And so that example is how the manufacturing and marketing of race-specific therapeutic drugs actually reinvigorates racial essentialism. So like these scholars, I'm interested in the intersection of genetic ancestry and race. But in my work, what I emphasize perhaps even more is the cultural politics of citizenship and belonging. And I also think differently than these scholars about where we should look to understand these intersections. So again, my work departs from this normative study of scientists, laboratories, and clinics as the privileged sites of genomic knowledge production. And instead, I approach DNA as a political and cultural object that emerges through social interactions that necessarily include non-experts. Okay, so while I account for the politics of expertise and expert sites of knowledge production, what I'm emphasizing here is what happens to genomic knowledge as it circulates among people whom it implicates, right? So research subjects rather than researchers, per se. I call this approach ethnography of situated genomics. And the concept here of being situated comes from feminist STS theorist Donna Haraway's classic essay, Situated Knowledges, first published in 1988, later republished in her 1991 book. And in this essay, Haraway argues for a version of objectivity that's grounded in one's acknowledgement that his or her perspective can only ever be partial. Okay, so there's no totalizing objectivity that any of us can actually access. Now here, objectivity and indeed the quality of scientific research are actually strengthened by one's ability to make the particular partiality of their perspective explicit. So the idea here is that all vision is a view from somewhere, and by definition, views from somewhere cannot be all-encompassing. Right, so that's the kind of background that's inspiring my approach here. Now, building on these insights, my argument is that the genetic ancestry studies and related humanistic research are actually both missing the perspective of the people who are recruited as research subjects, right? The people whose bodily materials constitute the raw data that ultimately make genetic ancestry research possible. Including these perspectives offers otherwise unavailable insights into how history, politics, and culture matter in any analysis of the significance of DNA and genetic knowledge. Through the concept of ethnography of situated genomics, I'm arguing here that to understand contemporary politics and power, we need to understand the emerging social significance of DNA. And to understand the social significance of DNA, we need to attend ethnographically to these multi-sided social lives of DNA and the people, again, from whom genetic samples derive. Now, my research shifts the focus from people who we might think of as puzzle solvers, so whether that's genetic scientists or people who are consumers of ancestry tests trying to solve puzzles, to puzzle makers. And I mean this in two senses. The Lemba people with whom I work have provided biological material to geneticists, thereby providing literal pieces of the global genetic puzzles that others have aimed to solve. But there's a second meaning here as well. The Lemba are also puzzle makers in the sense that their origins have been regarded as a puzzle for over 100 years. And you can see some indications of that here. The question is asked of them, are they a lost tribe of Israel in southern Africa? And here they're posed as the Black Jews of Africa. The issues at stake there are history, religion, and identity. Now, the Lemba do not fit neatly into racial or religious orders of things, not for geneticists and not for their research predecessors. Indeed, the genetic inquiries into Lemba origins didn't come out of nowhere. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Christian missionaries wrote about the Lemba as potential Semites, who they thought might be descended from Jews or maybe possibly from Muslims. Like geneticists, they based their analyses on Lemba oral history and also on Lemba embodied cultural practices like circumcision, endogamy, and dietary laws. Now, later work by Nicholas J. Van Vormelo, who some of you may have heard of, was South Africa's chief government ethnologist from 1930 through 1969, played a critical role in the apartheid legal status of the Lemba. And Lemba researchers, in turn, played a critical role in Van Vormelo's access to and interpretation of African culture and history. Like the missionary authors before him, Van Vormelo suspected that the Lemba might be related to Jews. But ultimately, he ended up classifying them as a subgroup among the Venda, rather than a separate group in their own right. And this is what became really consequential, including until today, for Lemba politics. So you might think, as many people do, that the Lemba participants in genetic studies were interested in proving their Jewishness so they might leave South Africa for Israel. Or alternatively, that upon learning their genetic results, they enthusiastically embraced Jewish religious practice. And this is kind of implied in these pictures, right? You see Lemba men with Jewish religious garb, right? Kind of implying that they are now religiously practicing Jews. And indeed, some people are, right? I'm not saying that nobody is. But ultimately, those conclusions, it's not really what I found when I did ethnographic research. Instead, what I found actually was that Lemba people have unexpected interpretations of their genetic test results that are informed by their own experiences of history, politics, and culture. Now, as they circulate their genetic interpretations amongst each other and various interlocutors, they ultimately reshape the meaning of genetic ancestry and the social significance of DNA. In the remainder of the talk now, I'm going to give you 3 examples of how this process works. The first describes an encounter between a Lemba traditional leader and an American Jew. The second, and not me, somebody else, although I was there. The second further explains that Lemba leader's interpretation and use of genetic data. And the third explores Lemba translation of genetic certainty into a politics of African belonging and indigeneity. Now together, these examples illustrate how Lemba people have used their genetic results to redefine the relationship to Jewish diaspora, South African citizenship, and African indigeneity. And for me, this is really where the significance of DNA lies, right? In these creative rearticulations of what it means and what you might do with it. Now, the field work that I did for this project, I did most of it actually between 2004 and 2006, with some follow-up work in 2010 and 2013, just to give you a range of the scope of the work that I did. Throughout that time, I followed the activities of an organization called the Lemba Cultural Association here at the bottom. I'll refer to them as the LCA. And those of Koshi, or Chief Mpakisani, one of them in the top there, who still to this day is not legally recognized as a traditional leader, although he is acknowledged locally as such. So people treat him as if he is Koshi, but according to the state, he is not. Now, the LCA began in the late 1940s as a way to formalize already existing gatherings and burial societies among Lemba families and clans, and to link them together into one coherent group. In the 1950s, with the support of the LCA, Hoshi Mpakitsani's father began to petition the apartheid government to recognize his chieftaincy. Hoshi Mpakitsani carried these efforts forward after his father died in 1989, and again, he still continues this to this day. Now, this project of recognizing Lemba chieftaincy was one part of the larger strategy that the LCA used beginning in the 1950s to seek recognition from the South African government as a distinct ethnic group. So as apartheid divide and conquer projects of separate development moved from ideology to implemented policy, Lemba identity became officially submerged under the language-based ethnic categories Venda and Northern Sotho. For the LCA, these policies inexorably linked recognition to difference. If they could prove their difference, they reasoned, then perhaps they might be recognized as Lemba instead of as Venda and as Northern Sotho. In the late 1980s, DNA technology appeared to Lemba leaders as a powerful tool of differentiation, one that they enthusiastically added to their growing toolkit of ways to make claims on the apartheid government. So in addition to spending time with these Lemba leaders and attending the meetings and events that occupied their time, I also became immersed in the daily lives of the people in the vicinity who had varying degrees of official involvement. This ethnographic approach further enabled me to see how a wide range of people interpreted genomic knowledge, and in some cases produced it. This was done overwhelmingly through their historical consciousness of the regional politics of race, religion, and authority, which I, of course, became implicated in through my presence. So elderly and sometimes middle-aged Lemba people would ask me if they were really Jews. Their questions were often accompanied by stories of their childhood interactions with white Christian missionaries, sometimes also stories of their parents' or grandparents' resistance to Christian conversion. The questions marked our inequality and the politics of knowledge production that made our encounters possible. In some cases, the questions offered me the authority to declare the truth. In other cases, the questions challenged my privileged relationship to truth claims, or tested whether my answers would match their own. Sometimes I was told that the Lemba are Jews rather than asked about it. One woman told me that because I'm a Jew, quote, it means you are a Lemba, end quote. Now her framing, in which it's Jews who might be incorporated as part of the Lemba, rather than the Lemba who might be incorporated as part of the Jews, challenges the idea that Lemba genetics must fundamentally be about reconnecting to Jewish diaspora. Nevertheless, American Jews in particular periodically seek out the Lemba, now popularized as a lost tribe of Israel, hoping to connect on the basis of a common Jewishness. The Lemba man depicted here, there, is Hoshi Mpakitsani. The white man here is an American modern Orthodox Jew named Roby Simons. Roby learned about the Lemba through an article in the New York Times, incidentally the same article through which I learned about the Lemba, and this Nova documentary. Both texts featured Lemba DNA as proof that they're a lost tribe of Israel. These texts, which are only two examples of many, traffic in familiar tropes about Africa that are reinforced by the lost tribes discourse. The story here is that these lost Jews, the Lemba, have now been found, right? But their Judaism is of the past rather than of the present, because the Lemba, who have now been isolated in Africa for millennia, are ignorant of modern Judaism, right? That's the trope that's being repeated. Now, the same practices that were noted by missionaries, circumcision and endogamy, among others, are remarked upon here as clearly not African, but rather as Jewish pretensions. And anyone who knows anything about African cultures knows that that's pretty intensely incorrect, right? There are many examples of circumcision and endogamy in Africa. But in other words, in this trope, Judaism has developed, right? But the Lemba have not. So the Lemba have been lost, left behind. Judaism has moved forward, now needs to return these lost Jews to Judaism. So this picture of Hoshiam Pakistani and Roby Simons is from 2005. Roby and I were both in South Africa conducting research funded by Fulbright, and they had distributed a list of project descriptions to all fellows. So Roby found out about my project that way, contacted me, wanted to come. I checked with people, they seemed interested, so he came. During the visit, Roby asked many people about Lemba Jewish practices and beliefs, and in turn he shared his own. Now when it became clear that these Lemba Jews were deeply committed members of the Zion Christ Church, Roby pointed out that Jews don't believe in Jesus, but he didn't dwell on it. Instead, what he did was he positively instructed, both verbally and by example. So this 2-day visit that he had involved a significant amount of conspicuous prayer, as you can see here. He had brought his own travel-sized prayer book, a yarmulke, talis, and tefillin. He prayed outside, chanting softly in Hebrew and swaying back and forth while the chickens, goats, and dogs ran around him, and both children and adults took the time to stare and wonder what they were seeing. Many people asked me about it later because they knew I was a Jew like him, and by that they meant that I was white and American and presumably religious. They hoped I might be able to explain his prayer. They wondered if I also prayed like that because they hadn't seen it happen, and they considered his presentation of Orthodox Jewish prayer against their own religious practices, which combined things like ancestor rituals and protections from witchcraft with aspects of various versions of Christianity. Roby's visit culminated with his encounter seen here with Hoshiam Pakistani. So Roby wanted to hand-deliver the leather-bound Torah that he had brought as a gift, and he wanted to demonstrate directly to Hoshiam Pakistani as the resident Lemba authority how to properly pray as a Jew. When he explained about kosher laws, Hoshiam Pakistani interjected that they know about that, and he had even written about it in his applications to the government for recognition. When Roby explained that when a boy has a bar mitzvah at 13, quote, for a while he's a chief, he's the leader, end quote, Hoshiam Pakistani seemed a bit put out, since his entire adult life had been dedicated to securing that status for himself. Nevertheless, he politely let it pass. And when Roby put on his talis and yarmulke, wrapped his tefillin, and started to pray, Hoshiam Pakistani sat there and chuckled uncomfortably. For Roby, the Lemba's genetic Jewishness was a point of departure, leading into Judaism. But for Hoshiam Pakistani and most other Lemba South Africans, Jewishness was something they had, not something they had to prove, demonstrate, or learn. Roby's religious instruction really failed to resonate with Hoshiam Pakistani's understanding of himself as Majuta Amaso, a black Jew. Nevertheless, Roby left the encounter feeling connected, while Hoshiam Pakistani left feeling properly recognized because of the gift, but disconnected from Roby's idea of Jewishness. I think I may have jostled this. Let's see. There we go. Do you mind if it's purple? I don't want to waste time, so I'll let it be purple and I'll continue. Now in this example, to bring it back to the point here, far from the laboratories of genetic researchers, Lemba DNA studies sparked an encounter that called Jewish diaspora into question, even as it also produced it. The DNA studies that aim to scientifically document a Jewish diasporic relationship, but they couldn't comment upon how a Lemba leader and an American Orthodox Jew navigated their different understandings of genetic Jewishness and what that might mean for their relations to Judaism and to one another. A few weeks before Roby's visit, Hoshiam Pakistani and I sat across from each other in the front room of his 2-room house. On that day, his kitchen table was covered with photocopies of his applications to government commissions and programs. Now, you're all South Africans, so you're probably fairly familiar with the form of the government commission, right? But just as a brief reminder, the transition away from apartheid rule in the mid-1990s in particular, included a massive amount of new legislation designed to implement democratic principles while simultaneously honoring and advancing the place of African tradition in government policy. In practice, these two goals were actually often at odds with each other, especially in relation to the status of traditional leadership, communal land rights, and customary law. And so briefly, critics argued that these were fundamentally undemocratic institutions, and supporters argued that they were a necessary part of decolonization because they evoked the authenticity of a pre-colonial past. 20 years later, so now, right, much of this really has yet to be resolved, although some decisions have been made. And continually, the task of bridging these gaps between democratic principles, legislative imperatives, and transformative implementation has fallen on commissions of inquiry. Hoshi and Pakistani applied to every commission that had any potential to grant him some aspect of this broad recognition that he sought. Collectively, these commissions had the potential to legally recognize his chieftaincy, to give him and his Lemba followers communal land rights to the village that they lived in alongside non-Lemba neighbors, and to grant him a permit to prospect for platinum there. And I should say quickly, none of these things have happened still, although he's hopeful that they may eventually. So Hoshi and Pakistani's applications really were the point where village politics and national belonging converged. By walking me through their contents, he was explaining to me the larger stakes that both shaped and amplified long-standing power struggles. And I won't go into it now, but the power struggles between these groups really arguably had gone on since the 1930s. Now, as we sat flipping through pages of applications, denial notifications, and reapplications, Hoshi and Pakistani emphasized to me their most pertinent contents. He explained to me that Lemba people established the village before white people had ever given it the name India, which is its unusual name today, and before the arrival of the Ndebele people, which is how he referred to his non-Lemba neighbors, who, by the way, don't consider themselves Ndebele people at all. His proof was that only Lemba people knew the original real name of the village, and they had named it after a river in Zimbabwe that had been significant to Lemba people in the past. Referencing the two Lemba genetic studies here, one of which were included in the round of applications that he had just submitted, he further explained to me, no one can argue with me, because this is evidence we have on the Y chromosome. Here, two different kinds of grounded claims came together. The original village name linked Lemba cultural history simultaneously to past and present Southern African landscapes, and Lemba DNA grounded that history in scientific certainty. Whatever the content of Lemba claims, now they were, or according to Hoshi and Pakistani, now they should be beyond argument, right, because of DNA. The link that Hoshi and Pakistani forged between DNA studies that located the Lemba outside of Africa and a place name that located them within it begs the question, how did Lemba people as political actors translate a genetic ancestry study that highlights their belonging elsewhere to these proprietary claims to traditional authority, land, and platinum mining that would territorialize their identities instead in South African places? Now, at first glance, Hoshi and Pakistani's definitive linking of first settlement and DNA is counterintuitive, because the former emphasized belonging in this space, in this specific South African place, and the latter spoke to belonging that went beyond Africa altogether. But both forms of evidence here actually potentially allowed for expansive belonging, in which they could be simultaneously and authentically of more than one place. The place name was significant precisely because it inscribed migration histories into local geographies, thus marking this place as belonging to Lemba people. DNA then substantiated Lemba people as a collectivity that held together biologically across disparate places. These forms of grounded and embodied evidence and the link that Hoshi and Pakistani forged between them bolstered his certainty that his own sense of his history and the rights that should follow from it were unassailable, and that eventually one of these commissions, or perhaps some future commission, would finally recognize him and his people. Indeed, the multi-generational struggle for state recognition of Lemba chieftaincy is the primary reason that Hossein Pakistani agreed to take part in Lemba genetic studies when volunteers were solicited. He felt that as one Lemba community's chief, he should be represented, and he hoped that the study would lend scientific credibility to his ongoing struggle for state legitimation. So again, this struggle that he was in was not new, but it did engage novel forms of evidence, as well as novel political and legal contexts in post-apartheid South Africa. As Lemba DNA became publicly detached from the Southern African context in which Lemba people lived, in the hands of Hossein Pakistani, it also became re-territorialized when he invoked this genetic archive as evidence of Lemba difference for the purposes of his post-apartheid claims. Now, the resonance between Hossein Pakistani's claims about rights, culture, and identity and discourses of indigeneity, which I'll turn to in a second, demonstrate explicit attempts to reframe Lemba difference, both biogenetic and cultural difference, as part of Africa, rather than defined against it. Now, in Pakistani's mobilization of genetic evidence and his applications is a form of genetic citizenship, in which DNA difference formed the basis of making particular claims on the state in the name of an inclusive citizenship. Invoking genetic difference in this way, again, re-territorialized Lemba DNA as South African and explicitly claimed it as potential evidence for post-apartheid citizenship. So Lemba DNA here stood out for Hossein Pakistani as valuable evidence because of its permanence. Like his own perseverance, he valued DNA as a permanent record that could outlast changing political imperatives to ultimately, eventually, deliver justice in the form of state recognition of Lemba ethnicity. For the Jewish genetic researchers in particular, and the publicity that their study generated, Lemba DNA had a different kind of value. It had value insofar as it could be detached from the Southern African context in which Lemba people lived, and territorialized instead in Israel. And Israel here for them was both mythic homeland and a contemporary nation state. For them, failure to find a genetic link between Lemba samples and those of the Jewish populations with which they were compared only would have indicated that this group of Africans was not really part of Jewish diasporic history, right? So it was kind of like a falsifiability claim that they were working with. And unlike the geneticists, Lemba men like Hossein Pakistani, who agreed to participate in the study, had no doubt that it would substantiate their links to Jews, because they were certain that their oral history, which spoke of these links, was historically correct, right? So they weren't worried that the studies would disprove what they said. And yet, they did hope that the study might provide far-reaching evidence of a different sort. Again, they participated in the genetic study in the hopes that scientific proof of their ancestry, and therefore of their difference from other Africans, might bolster these efforts to become legally recognized in South Africa. So, like the geneticists, they hoped that their DNA would be useful, right, but towards a different historical and political mapping. So mapping matters here in two senses. First, as a research genre, genetic ancestry is spatialized, right? Genetic historians study genomes so that they might reconstruct points of origin and pathways of migration of human groups. This is in part why so many critiques of this type of research have emphasized how it reiterates 19th century concepts of biologically distinct racial groups. The origins and pathways that have been identified have at times tended to emphasize continental distinctions between Africans, Asians, Europeans, and Native Americans. But my attention here, again, to mapping, it's not to echo the stakes of genetic ancestry researchers or their critics. It's rather to illuminate the ongoing stakes of those who participate in the genetic studies as research subjects, right? So here, Lemba recognition efforts, we can also understand them as spatialized. DNA was transformed from diasporic evidence into evidence in support of localized claims. At stake here was the idea of belonging in South Africa, explicit claims to land and minerals that might lay below the land's surface, and emerging notions of African indigeneity that were bound up with territorial authority and the ability to demonstrate one's earlier occupancy than one's neighbors in a disputed place. So, interestingly, as DNA was transformed into a different kind of evidence, it also facilitated transformed mappings of Jewish history. For example, this is current Lemba Cultural Association president, M.J. Mapungubwe, and he explained to me that Lemba are original Jewish, not nowadays for the changing things for the Reform and the Christianity and the Orthodox. We're African Jewish, because all Jews are from Africa, even the white. We're not the same as the white Jew because we don't change, we stick on the law. Now in this framing, the Lemba sustained Jewish ancestral past, and Reform Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, and Christianity were all equally divergent. Right, so it's not the old here that needs to be brought up to date, as in the popular media framing of Lemba genetics. Rather, it's the new that needed to reconnect with what they had lost over time. For Mapungubwe, Lemba DNA proved that all Jews are originally African. Here, Jews are by definition indigenous Africans, right? So Mapungubwe's vision of Lemba indigenous black Jewish belonging was not without its detractors. And I'm going to turn now to my third example. In 2007, the LCA participated in a reburial project at Mapungubwe. This project was spearheaded by the South African state and entailed the return of ancient remains, again in the name of African indigeneity. Mapungubwe's interpretation of the meaning of Lemba DNA and the LCA's participation in the Mapungubwe reburial raised the two questions that really frame my book manuscript. Here's the title of my book. The questions are, how could Lemba people view their blood as Jewish and their bones as African? Right? And then how socially, politically, and culturally does DNA matter? So by the Afterlives of genetic ancestry here, what I mean to signal is how the idea of DNA actually generates new knowledge and new social, cultural, and political formations after and even in the absence of scientific studies that are conducted by geneticists. So the Mapungubwe cultural landscape. It became South Africa's 5th UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2003. It's historically significant as Southern Africa's earliest known stratified kingdom. In the 13th century, Mapungubwe was a thriving trade center. Most of you probably know this history, at least in a basic level. Royals resided at the top of Mapungubwe Hill. About 5,000 others lived in villages on the ground. In the 1930s, researchers excavated graves on the hill and from surrounding settlements. And these remains, along with artifacts like pottery and beads, were subsequently stored at University of Pretoria. In 2005, the plans began to rebury these excavated remains. So in 2005, then President Thabo Mbeki appointed a commission, and another commission, and the commission decided that all potential stakeholders would participate in one joint claim to these remains. So although each group would get a chance to perform their own burial rites as part of one larger ceremony that they had to participate in together. So in 2006, in the midst of my research, other claimant groups were adamantly opposed to Lemba inclusion in this claim. And the LCA was deep in internal negotiations about how they were going to proceed. The group that was most opposed to Lemba inclusion were the leaders of the Vangona. And the Vangona are the only local group who have claimed continuous occupancy of the Mapungubwe area from the 10th century to the present. For this reason, they considered themselves to be more authentically indigenous than other claimant groups. But Vangona leaders singled out the Lemba when they voiced their concerns. They went so far as to write to Mbeki, explicitly asking to remove Lemba people from the reburial plans. Mapungubwe felt that he's the man who I quoted earlier, that the Vangona tried to exclude the Lemba because of the well-publicized stories of Lemba genetic links to Jews. He complained that once the Lemba are mentioned as black Jews, all other aspects of their history fall away, including their links to Mapungubwe. The objections of South African archaeologist Edwin Hanisch helps to explain why this happens. Hanisch was wary also that Lemba inclusion in the Mapungubwe reburial could be used to claim that the site was not actually an African kingdom at all, but rather that it resulted from a pre-colonial non-African presence. And this is a claim that had circulated about the related 15th century trading kingdom, Great Zimbabwe, from the time of its discovery in the 19th century. The Lemba became part of the Great Zimbabwe controversies in the 1960s. In 1967, the pro-apartheid journal Mankind Quarterly published an article that used two aspects of Lemba oral history, that they came from Judea and that they were part of the Great Zimbabwe Kingdom, as new evidence that the site was not built by Africans. The argument about the Lemba was that Great Zimbabwe was built by them, and they were necessarily not African because they were Jews. They couldn't be both. The larger politics of the argument about Great Zimbabwe, of course, was to delegitimize African civilization and to justify colonial domination. Now, Hanisch rejected the 1990s DNA results that claimed the Lemba as Jews, in part because he could not analytically separate these claims from the racist motivations of the 1960s claims about Great Zimbabwe. The logics that Hanisch rejected indicated that the Lemba could not be African because they were Jews. But his rejection recapitulated the logic in reverse, right? So for him, the Lemba couldn't be Jews because they were African. Now, he fundamentally could not reconcile the idea that they could be African and also have a Jewish history. At official gatherings of Lemba people in 2006, Lemba leaders announced that the Mapungubwe remains were theirs, and that DNA tests had proved it, just as DNA tests had proved that they were black Jews who made their way as traders into Africa centuries before Mapungubwe was established. Here's the thing, the Mapungubwe DNA test turned out to be only a rumor, right? So no tests were ever done, no bones were ever tested. They were never linked definitively to one group or another. But as far as Lemba leaders were concerned, the genetic links to Jews, just as genetic links to Jews proved that their oral history was accurate and they were who they said they were, the Mapungubwe bones were real and proved that they were indigenous. Sorry, the genetic links to the Mapungubwe bones were real and proved that they were indigenous. So in these public presentations that Lemba leaders did, the two DNA tests appeared equally factual. And they together proved to Lemba people, right, and it's important who the audience is here, that it was not a contradiction to be both Jews and Africans. For the Lemba, DNA operated as a mechanism through which to bring together foreignness and Africanness, blood and bones, Lemba difference, and Lemba belonging. So in closing, I want to return again to the questions raised when approaching DNA from a cultural anthropology and STS perspective. So as these examples have illustrated, what ethnography shows us is how culture matters in relation to DNA. What happens when DNA is brought to bear on matters of culture? Participants in genetic ancestry studies, such as the Lemba studies that I've discussed, continually reshape the meaning of genetic ancestry as they circulate their interpretations of their genetic test results amongst each other and various interlocutors. These ongoing circulations are how genetic studies are lived by the people whose bodies produce genetic data. The question remains, though, how does DNA become meaningful in society? Or put another way, how socially, politically, and culturally does DNA matter? Now I want to answer this question by returning to the idea of situated genomics. As I've demonstrated, situated genomics complicates our attention to scientific and humanistic analyses of genetic meanings, with equal attention to the perspectives of genetic research subjects. Here, histories, broader social contexts, and cultural values and meanings all contribute to ongoing knowledge production about genetics that is not necessarily in conversation with geneticists. This approach opens up the possibility of analyzing both direct and indirect social consequences of genetic studies. Right? When we think about how do we frame the ethics of our research, it kind of brings a new question to that area of inquiry, because there's so much indeterminacy, there's so many things that we can't predict, right, and how DNA matters. Now, when we privilege the social circulation of DNA, which I've done here, whether that means the racial religious histories of those who provide genetic samples or the genomic knowledge that they produce, we can begin to account for how citizenship and science converge, and how their convergence is socially, politically, and culturally consequential. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for discussion, questions. Silence. David Bennett.
What about you? That brief video me, if you don't mind. I wonder whether you've thought about the Ethiopian Jews. I imagine that there are comparative issues there as well.
Should I take a few questions and then answer them together, or do you want me to do one?
No, I think go ahead. I haven't seen too many other hands,
Okay,
so
sure.
maybe go ahead with David,
Okay, well,
and then
I'll do
we'll.
one at a time, okay? Yeah, so that's a really interesting comparison, in part because the Ethiopian Jews stand really differently in relation to Judaism than the Lemba do, right? While their identity as Jews has at times been incredibly contentious, you know, because the Israeli state recognized them as Jews and brought them to Israel as Jews, and many of them, both prior to that and subsequently, practice what is recognizable to other Jews in the world as Judaism, right? When there were genetic studies done about their ancestry that didn't really show evidence of links to Jews, it didn't really undermine their claims because they had this sort of robust existing claim to Jewish belonging, right? For the Lemba, one of the things that's really interesting, there is a small group of Lemba people who practice Judaism. But for most Lemba people, it's been incredibly important to show that Jewishness for them is not at odds with Christianity, right? Is not at odds with any other religious practices because it's part of their history of who they are, right? So they have a really different sense of what Jewishness is than Ethiopian Jews do.
Thanks.
Isn't that at the core of entitled? What does it mean to be Jewish? There's different things to different people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Look, I'm just a little bit concerned. I'm going to take direction from Jacquie because it's 2 o'clock right now, and different people have to go to different things. And Jacquie, whether to postpone the discussion to upstairs, or do you want to take a few questions here? I'll have to be on a telecall in a moment.
I can try to be super concise about it.
No. Sure. I just want to gauge how do people here feel. What do you
Can
think?
we see how many more questions there are? Because
I think
otherwise
there'll be
we'll
lots,
take
actually.
those too.
Yeah. Okay. 1, 2. Anybody else? Don't be shy.
I think that's it.
Okay. Let's
And
take these
just
3.
finish it quickly, and
Gary,
then
let's
go.
go with you, and then we'll.
So I think you alluded to Lemba in Zimbabwe. Have they, are the Lemba that you've been working with, an offshoot or derived from that group? And have they had similar issues with chieftainships and land and so on in Zimbabwe?
Okay, great. So that's a fantastic question. So yeah, they're literally related, like in terms of families are on one side or the other at times. This is not a large group of people, right? One thing that's different about Lemba people in Zimbabwe is there's a small group there now that is connected with an American group called Colonial, which is a Jewish organization that specifically aims to find lost Jews and bring them back to Judaism. That's kind of how they frame it. And a number of people in that community have formally converted. and are kind of spearheading efforts to make more Lemba people religiously Jewish.
Okay, thank you. And you can follow up those discussions at lunch.
Do you have a sense of how let's say, non-Lemba Jews in South Africa have responded to the DNA studies, and then also we could speak a little about the relationship between Lemba and say, traditional Jews in South Africa? Is it a reciprocal relationship?
Sure.
How's that played out? And the final element to that, how does the Israeli state view the Lemba? Has there been any attempt to claim beyond Kulanu of the Lemba?
Okay. So in regards to the first part of the question, so there have been various attempts at beginning from actually before the DNA studies from Lemba people to connect to South African Jews. Early on, they were mostly kind of rejected. After the studies, there have been a few mainstream South African Jews who have wanted to have connections, but by and large, most official Jewish organizations hold to a religious definition of Judaism. And if you're saying you're a Christian, they generally don't really want anything else to do with you. So that's been the majority opinion. It's really been American Jews who are really captured by this idea of DNA, of Jewish DNA. There's something about this search for lost tribes that's really fascinating to Americans. I'm not sure why. The Israeli state, the question hasn't come up in part because Lemba South Africans aren't actually trying to go there, right? So they don't really feel questions are put to them, right? And I realized I didn't answer your question about in Zimbabwe, the same questions about chieftaincy and land. I can't really adequately answer that question because I haven't done field work in Zimbabwe, but my sense is that it's not as contentious. It's my sense, but it's a preliminary answer.
I'd like to ask you two things. In your studies of South Africans, would you say that we're a homogeneous group, or are we a whole group of very independent races? And the other question I'd like to ask you, is there such a thing as the Jewish race?
Okay.
Now we're good.
So I should say, again, I should remind you all, I'm not a geneticist, right? So the way I can answer your first question would probably be really different than how a geneticist might approach the question. For me, I think no group is a homogeneous group. I think culture is incredibly contentious, always being negotiated, always being reformulated. There's always different ideas of who we are, how we should relate to each other, where we come from, and South Africa is incredibly diverse in that respect. But again, that's not from a genetic standpoint because I'm not a geneticist. So you'll have to ask some of the other colleagues in the room about that part of the question. Is there a Jewish race? So I recently put together like a bibliography for Oxford Bibliographies online on Jewish genetics. And one of the questions that's been asked, even before the contemporary age of genetic research, so when people were doing blood group studies, right, repeatedly the question is asked by geneticists and scientists, is there a Jewish race? Pretty much they always answer no. With the only caveat I have to saying that is that there's recent studies that people are doing around Jewish hat mapping. And their conclusions are that Jews constitute distinct groups, clusters of populations that nevertheless have genetic connections between them, so like threads of connection. Now, some people have argued that framing it in that way makes it seem as if there's a Jewish race. The people doing that research would argue otherwise, right? They don't feel that their research supports the idea that there's a Jewish race at all.
Okay. Is there any further comment to that particular discussion? Because if not, we'll then close. And thank you very much, Noah. It was very interesting.